Imagine waking up in the morning and realizing that all the money you've saved over your lifetime, savings that could buy a house yesterday, can now barely buy a loaf of bread. That the moment you receive your salary, it's already almost worthless. That people are carrying money, not in wallets, but in wheelbarrows. This isn't some dystopian fantasy. This is hyperinflation. And it has happened far more times than you might think. We tend to think of money as something stable, something we can trust. But history tells us the exact opposite. And worse, hyperinflation hasn't just destroyed bank accounts. It has destroyed governments, families, and entire empires. It has swept through societies like a financial wildfire, exposing just how fragile our systems really are. Now, you're going to see how the currencies of 5 countries, 5 real economies, collapsed, and what it cost them. And as you listen, keep this in mind. Inflation is never obvious at first. It creeps in, it whispers. And by the time most people realize it, it's already too late to escape. Let's start with Germany. 1923, the Weimar Republic. After World War I, Germany was left under massive debt. The Treaty of Versailles imposed over 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an amount so large it would take generations to repay. So what did the German government do? It printed money. A lot more money. At first it seemed manageable. Then prices doubled, then tripled, and then it exploded. By November 1923, the German mark was nearly worthless. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. People started burning money just to stay warm. Children played with stacks of cash. Middle-class families watched their life savings disappear in a matter of weeks. But the real damage ran deeper. It wasn't just the currency that collapsed. Trust collapsed with it. When a society loses faith in its currency, everything begins to fall apart. Trade, contracts, savings, salaries, all of it. This financial collapse also triggered social collapse. Desperation and chaos created opportunities for extremists. Just 10 years later, Adolf Hitler rose to power, and this economic trauma was one of the key reasons. Now let's fast forward to the early 2000s, to Zimbabwe. President Robert Mugabe's government was facing sanctions and economic isolation. The government began large-scale land seizures, which devastated agricultural production. And what was their response? Yes, printing money. And the cycle began again. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached approximately 79.6 billion%. Prices were doubling every 24 hours. The government kept adding zeros to the currency. 10 million, 100 billion. $100 trillion banknotes were printed. Eventually, they gave up. They switched to foreign currencies like the US dollar and the South African rand. But what was the cost? It wasn't just numbers on paper. Hyperinflation wiped out pensions, collapsed industries, and created an entire generation of economic refugees. Real wealth, land, skills, tangible assets became the only things that survived. Now let's go further back. Hungary, 1946. This is often considered the worst hyperinflation ever recorded in history. After World War II, Hungary's economy was devastated. To cover war debts and reconstruction costs, the government began printing its currency, the pengo, at an unbelievable pace. At its peak, prices were doubling every 15 hours. The inflation rate reached 41.9 quadrillion%. That's a 4 followed by 16 zeros. The currency became so worthless that this government introduced new banknotes, mil pengo, worth 1 million. Pengo, B, pengo, worth 1 billion pengo. But even that wasn't enough. Eventually, the government abandoned the currency entirely and restarted with a new one, the forint. What did they lose? Everything. Hungary's middle class was wiped out. Savings accounts were reset to zero, and the government lost whatever legitimacy it had left. Hyperinflation didn't just reset the economy, it erased the past. Now let's move to Latin America. Venezuela 2010s. A country rich in oil, full of resources, but politically collapsed. Years of corruption, price controls, nationalizations, and mismanagement turned one of the richest countries in the region into a cautionary tale. The government printed money to cover budget deficits, fund failing programs, and maintain control. And once again, inflation exploded. In 2018, Venezuela's inflation exceeded 1,000,000%. Imagine getting paid and having to spend it the same day, because by tomorrow it might be worth half as much. Store shelves were empty. Barter returned. Doctors and engineers left the country to work as delivery drivers abroad. And just like Zimbabwe, the government printed new banknotes with more zeros. Eventually, they removed 6 zeros from the currency overnight. But damage like this cannot be erased. Hyperinflation destroyed Venezuela's economy, collapsed its healthcare system, and turned millions into migrants. Once again, the same truth emerged. Those with access to tangible assets or dollars survived. The rest did not. Now let's look at a much lesser-known example. Yugoslavia, 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the violent breakup of the country, Yugoslavia's economy collapsed under the weight of war, sanctions, and mismanagement. In 1993, inflation reached 313% per month. Prices were doubling every 1.4 days. The government kept introducing new currencies in an attempt to regain control, each time wiping out old savings. People turned to the German mark and the US dollar just to survive. The official currency became a joke, used to light cigarettes or cover the walls of abandoned shops. And beneath all of these examples, the same pattern repeats. A government faces a crisis, prints money, trust disappears, the currency collapses, society fractures, again and again. Different countries, different years, but the same mistake. Now you might be thinking, that was in the past. We're smarter now. But are we? Today, global debt levels are at the highest point in history. The United States alone has over $34 trillion in national debt, and it's still growing. Central banks around the world have printed trillions of dollars over the past decade to keep economies afloat, keep interest rates low, and support markets. For a while, it seemed to work. Inflation was low. Growth continued. The system held, until it didn't. In 2021 and 2022, something changed. Inflation, which had been low for years, began rising rapidly. Supply chain shocks, the war in Ukraine, energy prices, and yes, the trillions of dollars that had been printed, finally started to show their effects. Suddenly, central banks shifted from printing money to aggressively raising interest rates. Markets shook, and ordinary people, who never fully benefited from the era of cheap money, started to feel the pressure. Rents surged, food prices rose, wages couldn't keep up. And for the first time in decades, people began asking difficult questions again. What is money? Who controls it? What happens when trust breaks? We are not at hyperinflation levels, yet. But the warning signs are there, not just in prices, but in mindset. The belief that printing money can solve structural problems. The idea that we can borrow forever. The assumption that central banks will always save the system. These are dangerous assumptions. The same assumptions made in Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. The difference today is scale. For the first time in history, the global economy is this interconnected, this debt-driven, and this dependent on central bank intervention. If trust breaks now, it won't just affect one country. It could affect the entire system. And that brings us to you. You may not control the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, but you can control your exposure, your savings, your habits, your mindset. So what can you learn from the 5 worst hyperinflations in history? First, real wealth is not paper. Real wealth is purchasing power. Land, skills, tangible assets, networks that can produce value. In every one of these countries, printed wealth disappeared. But those who owned real assets survived and continued to survive. Second, trust is everything. Currencies don't collapse because ink runs out. They collapse because people stop believing. And that belief can disappear much faster than most people think. Once it's gone, rebuilding it is almost impossible. Third, inflation punishes the unprepared. It moves fast. It compounds. And it hits wage earners the hardest. Governments can inflate away their debt. But you can't inflate away your grocery bill. That's why financial education isn't just about growing wealth. It's about protecting it. So, what does protection look like today? Understanding the system instead of blindly trusting it, reducing unnecessary debt, diversifying your assets, not just across stocks, but across systems. Maybe that means holding some hard money. Maybe it means learning a skill that retains value no matter what the markets do. Maybe it means building and maintaining a more sustainable, lower-cost lifestyle. But most importantly, remember this. Inflation is a hidden tax, a form of wealth transfer, a slow erosion of your financial freedom. If you don't know how to protect against it, the 5 worst hyperinflations in history were not random events. They were the result of bad policies, wars, denial, arrogance, and the illusion that money can be created without consequences. But now you know better. You've seen the pattern. And the next time someone tells you, that could never happen here, you'll know exactly what to say. History doesn't repeat itself exactly. But if you don't understand it, it can still crush you.